First up, let's welcome our first candidate on stage tonight, MJ Hegar.
Good to see you.
Hi,
good to see you. One of my two favorite voices. I'm so excited. The other one just walked in.
So let's just get right to it. John Cornyn today introduced a gun bill. I'm sure you have some thoughts about that.
I have a couple. Yeah. Would you like to hear them?
Let's hear them.
First of all, thanks to Moms Demand Action in the House, doing so much great work. I don't think anyone is surprised at if anybody had, took the time to read what was in the bill. It sounds like it was written by an employee of the gun lobby, right? You would think that expanded background checks, universal background checks would be something that is a safely bipartisan thing since 90% of our country wants it, 90% of our state wants it. The other 10% hit the wrong button on their phone during the poll, I think. Okay, let me back up. I'm a combat veteran, all right? I have used these weapons for their intended purpose in war, and that's where they should belong. The combat zones, we fight in the places that we fight to try to keep the combat from getting to our streets, and the combat is in our streets right now. Our kids aren't safe. Our citizens are having to experience hypervigilance in public places. Open carry is an assault on every bystander. It takes away our ability to be able to see something, say something, and call law enforcement and get help when we see somebody walking around in a festival or something with an automatic rifle strapped to their chest. That happened to me recently. I'm a combat vet, but I'm also a mom. So I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. We were walking through Pecan Street Festival, and here comes this guy walking around with his rifle strapped to his chest, and I'm like, kids, I know half your face is painted and half of your balloon is into a dog, but let's go. We're leaving. And that's not right, all right? So we need an end to open carry. We absolutely have to stop selling weapons of war to the public. We aren't even talking about trafficking and the money that the gun lobby is making on trafficking 250,000 weapons across our southern border every year, and then we complain when the crisis, the violence, causes a humanitarian crisis at our southern border. We can do better. We have to do better. And I'm embarrassed at the bill that John Cornyn put forward. It is clearly written by somebody who has the gun lobby's best interests at heart. It shows how disconnected he is from Texas, because most of what I see him do is to appease donors who are, the people who he's fighting for, or to get reelected in self-preservation. And I think if he knew anything about what was happening in his own state, he would never put forward a gun bill that doesn't have, at least at a minimum, universal background checks. He cashed a $1,000 check from the NRA 2 weeks after the El Paso shooting. So if you're wondering who he's serving, it's not us.
So on the topic of gun violence, but from a different valence. Recently, in my hometown of Fort Worth, a police officer shot and killed a Tatiana Jefferson in her home. Mm-hmm. She was caring for her nephew at the time, and this is not the first instance of an innocent Black person being shot and killed by police in their home in Texas recently. What would you do about that?
I think it's really important. I feel like a lot of people are acting like these are new problems because of the current administration, and they want to blame it on certain individuals. And I frankly think that one of the silver linings of what's happening in our politics today is that it's making us unable to turn a blind eye and say that these problems that have existed in our country for decades and centuries, that nobody can say that they don't exist anymore. You used to hear people say that, oh, it's 2015, we don't have a gender problem or a race problem, or and you just don't hear people say that anymore, because you can't walk into a doctor's office and not tell him your symptoms, or her, and expect them to cure you. So at least nobody's denying that we have these problems now, if there is any silver lining. But I can say that while there is so much work that needs to be done, and only part of that can be done legislatively, we absolutely have to hold our elected officials and any role models responsible for the rhetoric in this country. So when we have, a president who flippantly uses a term like lynching, That has to be, we have to hold him responsible for that and accountable for that. He has to be called out for that. But when we have a senator like John Cornyn, who is retweeting kind of race-baiting articles about the growth in the Latino community in Texas instead of what an amazing thing that is, acting like it's something that people should be aware of and using fear to try to get reelected, that has real consequences. You know, he doesn't see beyond the election for the consequences. It's things like that that contributed to the El Paso shooting. It's things like that that are contributing to, you know, acts of violence and hate. I mean, we have a domestic terrorism problem. We have a white nationalism problem. And I really feel like it's a leadership issue first, but I'm at least glad that we aren't in a place where we're denying that these problems exist.
By his own admission, changing gears for a second, by his own admission, President Trump pressured countries like Ukraine and China to dig up dirt on a domestic political opponent. His own staff has admitted today, at a quid pro quo. And yesterday, the President even said the emoluments clause was phony. Knowing all of this now, in the past 2-3 weeks, do you support impeachment outright, beyond an inquiry, which you have said you support, like a majority of Americans now do?
You know, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and that is what I will always come back to. And I fulfilled that oath. You know, the oath was to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And usually when you put on the uniform in the military, you're expecting to take on foreign threats to our Constitution. And I think we're all very clear on what a domestic threat to our Constitution looks like. Right now, it goes beyond, for me, the Ukraine calls and the China and things like that. Right now, for me, I'm witnessing a dismantling of our democracy in a nonpartisan way that, you know, I have an administration that's ordering people to ignore congressional subpoenas. We had today a group of Congress members storming a SCIF, which, as a prior military officer who has held the highest levels of security clearance when I was working with the B-2 stealth program, TXSCI, the consequences for unauthorized people, especially bringing cell phones into a SCIF, are severe, and I hope that they will face those consequences. But I'm seeing a complete disregard for the respect of the co-equal branch of government, for the Constitution, for the rule of law, beyond just professionalism and decorum and the things that are making us lose respect on the world stage. So I do believe I have seen enough to think that the evidence from the inquiry is going to show impeachable offenses. I believe I've seen enough from the comments of the president and from the things that we've all read in the press. But I'm also cognizant that those are things we've read in the press. And so I'm going to respect the process, and it's important that that process proceed legally and ethically and, you know, by the book, which they're doing right now, I think. Of course, I say they're doing. I think that the Democrats are proceeding by the book. I don't think it's by the book for the White House to tell their State Department employees to ignore congressional subpoenas. There's people who say that would rather see this happen at the polls. I actually understand that. I do. I understand the desire for people that would rather see him lose the election because, frankly, it's less divisive, and frankly, I'm very national security minded, and it helps our reputation on the world stage that we can show the rest of the world this is not who we choose to lead us, right? So I would also like to see him lose an election. But we have an oversight responsibility in the co-equal legislative branch, and we are setting a precedent, and we are telling future generations what behavior is acceptable. And if we allow the behavior that I'm seeing reported on in the press and the statements from the president to go unchecked, then that is a huge mistake going forward. And my oath to the Constitution demands that I fully support the impeachment proceedings going forward.
Changing gears again, with sea temperatures rising, with climate change, as we know, yes, indeed, storms like Hurricane Harvey that devastated Houston will become stronger and more frequent. Mm-hmm. What policies do you support to address climate change, A, and B, to specifically protect poorer communities and communities of color, which so often
Yes.
bear the disproportionate brunt of climate change.
And then receive a disproportionately less amount of assistance afterwards.
Indeed.
The two reasons I'm running for this office are, one, because of my oath to the Constitution and because of what I'm watching happen on the global stage, not just national security, but foreign policy and our reputation, okay? Dismantling the State Department, alienating our allies and bullying our enemies. I'm concerned on a global scale of what the impact of the leader of the free world is having globally. But then the very close second, if not tied for first reason, I'm a mom. I have a 5 and a 2-year-old, like I mentioned. I'm a working mom. I come from a blue-collar family. I'm the first person who graduated from college in my family. And I see a real disconnect. When I look at DC, I don't see our values reflected back of regular working Americans and Texans. I see DC values and obstructionism and things like that. So, the greatest threat to my kids, and the reason I'm running is to protect my kids and because I took an oath. The greatest threat to my kids is climate change. And I don't have to tell the people in this audience who are on the front lines of that because of what's been happening with the devastating hurricanes and catastrophic flooding, that it's here. It's a problem we have to deal with now. I talk to people, I drive all across Texas all the time. We've driven over 7,000 miles, talked to thousands of people, and I'm out there and people agree. There's this sense that for some reason aggressive action on climate change is somehow not politically tenable. I disagree. I'm not looking at polls. I'm talking to people and shaking hands, and people need and want leadership that is going to take aggressive action on climate change. I think that we actually here in Texas have a unique ability to lead on this issue. Not only are we a leader in the energy industry already, we can not become the blockbuster of the energy industry and, hold on to old technology. We can be the forward-thinking state, and we can lead on green renewable energy. It's a job creator. It's good for our economy. We have potential for solar and wind like no other state. We're already having wind farms that are exporting energy to other states. So Texas should lead on this issue like on many issues, and it's not going to lead while we have John Cornyn as our senator, trying to feed his corporate PAC cronies instead of answer to his constituents. So I think that we need to take aggressive action. I think we need to lead there, but I have a close relationship with labor, and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers often reminds me to please never talk about green renewable energy without also talking about our need to modernize the grid. We must have a massive infrastructural investment to modernize the grid to where it can handle peak load on renewable energy. It is clearly the future, and Texas is in a great position to step forward and bring jobs to Texas and lead in this industry.
Final question. Final question. This was sent to us by our friends at Progress Texas in Austin. In 2018, the one place Beto O'Rourke didn't do so well on voter turnout was in the Rio Grande Valley. Excuse me. What's your plan for mobilizing Democrats there?
So I don't know that I agree that that's the one place, because I think that there were, I outperformed Beto and the other statewide candidates in the rural half of my congressional district. There were rural areas that, for too long we've been, and I don't think Beto made this mistake because he drove all over the state, but for too long we've been focused on the cities. And I do think that we need to, I grew up in very rural, Republican-held Texas, and I think that we need to definitely not write off either the RGV or rural communities or West Texas or different places that people have been telling me don't waste your time. I completely disagree. I am out there in talking to people about kitchen table issues, what gets food on the table. In the Rio Grande Valley, when I'm there, some candidates I think make the mistake of going and just talking about immigration. That's a huge mistake, because we're talking to Texans and Americans and parents and people who are worried about, like I said, getting food on the table, getting the kids to soccer practice, our national security. We're talking a lot of times to legal immigrants who are concerned with, talk of asylum seekers. And it's a very complex issue, immigration is. So we don't just go and talk about immigration. We, say, hey, we are Texans. We are going to turn out the vote because we have choices on the ballot where we can send somebody to DC to speak with us, not for us, but bring our voices to DC and actually enact legislation that works for working families. When I'm in the RGV, in addition to immigration, we're talking about things like people pursuing citizenship through military service. They're a very patriotic group. They love this country. And we talk a lot about how people who are pursuing citizenship sometimes get deployed to combat zones and come home, and thanks to minor misdemeanors that, a lot of combat vets are committing, they get deported and don't have access to VA services for traumatic brain injury, PTSD, things like that. So we're going to be very hyper local in everything that we're doing. We're running a very coordinated campaign. We're planning on running very coordinated up and down the ballot, and hyper localizing everything, because frankly, people talk about border communities, but El Paso is very different than McAllen and Brownsville. I mean, you actually have to go into communities and shake hands and look people in the eye and listen to their concerns and listen to the complexities of the issues and talk to them about the solutions that are going to help them keep their families safe and raise their kids.
I like one more quick question. I know you got to catch a plane. It's a good one though. So what about, look, I think a lot of folks in the audience and people watching are interested in viability, right? Up against Cornyn if you're the nominee. So what about you and your campaign should give Democrats confidence you can beat him? What's your path to victory?
So first of all, he's not this giant hill to climb, okay? He is not popular. He doesn't get a single independent vote from what I've seen in the data. My plan is to do the same thing I've done my whole life, frankly. When I was 7, I wanted to be Han Solo, okay? And people told me, you can't be a combat pilot, you can't be this renegade because women aren't allowed to do that. I set off on a path. It was difficult. It took hard work and sacrifice, and I made it. I became a combat pilot. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan. Then I found myself shot down, surrounded by 150 enemy fighters. There were 9 of us, 4 of us were injured. Well, there were only a couple paths out there, to get everybody out alive, and we managed to do it. We were pulled together as a team. We focused on the mission, and we got everybody out alive. Then I partnered with the ACLU to take on a policy in the military barring women from competing for military elite positions, and was told there's no way you're going to change 200 years of military history and policy. But I saw the path. I put myself on it. I did the work necessary. I fought and I didn't back down. And by the way, I built a broad coalition of support from the right and the left without sacrificing our values. We have to do that. We cannot think of building broad coalitions as meeting people halfway. You have to know where your values are. You have to know where you stand and what you're fighting for, but you can reach in and bring agreement out in people if you speak their language and figure out what's in it for them and what would motivate them to agree with you. So I would talk to the left about women's rights and the Constitution, but I would talk to the right about military effectiveness and recruiting and retention. It was very effective. So how am I going to beat John Cornyn? I'm going to show this state, like I am now, driving all over it and talking to people and meeting them where they are and talking in their language and using kitchen table issues. I'm going to show them that they have a choice in November. They can vote for somebody who is, very mission driven at fighting for working families, or John Cornyn, who is mission driven in covering his butt like he did with the gun legislation. It's just total CYA, do nothing legislation, more of the same. They can vote for the ass kisser, or they can vote for the ass kicker, who is going to go and fight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
There's a really important election happening, so if you haven't voted yet, please go vote. There are so many great candidates here in Houston that I'm excited about, and if Marcel, if you're here in the audience, I'm talking to you, buddy. All right, so vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.